In the punishing frontier winters of 1871, a standard wooden cabin delivered nothing more than a fragile illusion of warmth. Settlers devoured as many as 20 cords of firewood per season, all just to keep death by freezing at arm's length. So when Swiss immigrant Lucas Abbey disregarded the towering pines of Montana's Bitterroot Valley and started raising his home from cold river stone, the local carpenters laughed. They cautioned him he was erecting a frozen tomb. But Lucas carried knowledge of a forgotten scientific principle of survival, one that would hold his dwelling at a steady 58 degrees even when the air plunged to 20 below zero, hours after the last ember had gone dark. His peculiar undertaking began amid the remnants of an abandoned fur trading post. To the other men, those crumbling walls were salvage, a handful of useful stones for a hearth, then forgotten again. To Lucas, they were a foundation. Grant Hollis, the settlement's most esteemed carpenter, set down his work to watch. He rested one broad hand on his broadaxe, its polished handle still warm from his grip. Flanking him stood two fellow settlers, Silas Croft and Jebediah Kane. Their faces carried that unmistakable stamp of frontier pragmatism laced with doubt. They observed as Lucas Abbey hacked back undergrowth, leveraged loose stones free, and mixed a crude mortar of mud and straw inside a shallow pit. Grueling labor, painstaking, and to their eyes, entirely without reward. Hollis called across the crisp air at last. His authority went unchallenged. The man had personally raised nearly half the structures dotting their settlement. Kane let out a low grunt of agreement. Lucas Abb stopped, drew his sleeve across his forehead. He studied the massive stones arrayed before him, then lifted his gaze toward the tall, flawless lodgepole pines earmarked for Hollis's homes. He was a man of sparse words, his English still threaded with the deep, rolling cadence of his native Swiss German. What he offered back was brief, and only thickened the confusion. "The stone holds the sun's warmth," he said. Nothing more. He turned back to his work, muscling a heavy granite boulder into a gap along the wall. The dense, resonant thud of its placement was his only further argument. The men traded glances, now thoroughly convinced this Swiss fellow had taken leave of his reason. In a land drowning in timber, he had chosen to shelter himself inside a heap of rocks. But the advancing Montana winter would judge both approaches without a shred of mercy. What could this Swiss stonemason, a man bred in the deep, unrelenting cold of the Alps, possibly understand about thermal mass? And what had the finest frontier carpenters, those masters of wood and efficiency, completely failed to see? The answer rests not in ingenuity alone, but in a different understanding of time, temperature, and the fundamental purpose of shelter. The forgotten science of thermal mass, a principle so powerful it transforms a stone wall into a radiating source of heat. By the end of this account, the mechanism will be unmistakable, how sheer thickness defeats the most savage cold. Before going further, take a moment to subscribe and tap the notification bell for more stories of frontier innovation. And drop a comment below. What is the most extreme temperature you have ever endured? Lucas A.B. was no ordinary frontiersman. Not a hunter, not a trapper, not even a farmer by trade. He was a Steinmetz, a master stonemason, from the high valleys of Graubünden, Switzerland. His hands answered not to the axe or plow, but to hammer and chisel. He read the world through the texture of granite, the layered grain of slate, the heft of limestone. Every year of his life had been spent among objects of tremendous scale and stubborn permanence. The 3-foot-thick walls of alpine chalets, engineered to bear 10 feet of crushing snow. The massive tiled Kachelofen stoves that warmed an entire home for a full day on one load of wood. The precisely fitted stone foundations that anchored buildings to mountainsides, not for years, but for centuries. Lucas thought in tons, not pounds, in decades, not seasons. He had crossed the Atlantic with his wife Anya and their two small children, Emile and Sophie, chasing land and the promise of something better. What met them during that first Montana winter of 1870 was a cold that bore no resemblance to anything in their experience. The alpine freeze back home was deep, but still, a thing you could wall out with sheer mass. The Montana cold was something else entirely. It was a living antagonist. It rode an unrelenting wind that found every crack, every joint, every nail hole in the standard wooden cabin they had rushed to secure. That first winter taught them suffering. The wind, a ceaseless, groaning force pressing down from the north, passed through the thin plank walls as though they were canvas. Anya spent her days pressing rags and moss into every gap she could find, waging a losing war against an invisible enemy. They burned through wood at a terrifying pace. The small iron stove glowed cherry red, yet its heat seemed to vanish within inches of the cast iron. The air inside that single room existed in cruel layers. Suffocating warmth pooled against the ceiling, while the floor ran so cold that spilled water froze on contact. By midnight, the fire always faltered. Their evening's labor wasted. They crawled into bed fully dressed, heaping every blanket and animal hide they owned on top of themselves. Morning greeted them with their own breath hanging in pale clouds and a thin, merciless lacework of frost clinging to the nailheads along the interior walls. Every nail, a tiny bridge, conducting the brutal cold straight into their home. Anya developed a deep, rattling cough that clung to her for months. The children stayed perpetually cold. Their skin went pallid. Their movements turned sluggish. Lucas, a man who had believed he understood cold, stood helpless. He had failed them. He swore it would never happen again. He would not fight the cold with the brittle weapon of wood. He would meet it with the one material he truly knew, stone. The weakness of the standard frontier dwelling had nothing to do with poor craftsmanship. Grant Hollis was a masterful carpenter. His joints were tight, his planks flush. The failure was rooted in physics. The structures he and others raised were designed for milder climates, borrowed patterns from gentler places, and they were catastrophically mismatched against the thermal brutality of a high plains winter. The core problem was an absence of thermal mass. A standard 1-inch pine board carries an R value, the measure of its resistance to heat flow, of roughly 1. A typical frontier cabin wall, built from a single layer of planks, offered barely more protection than a thick coat. The enormous volume of heat thrown off by the wood stove, a torrent of British thermal units, or BTUs, had nowhere productive to go. It heated the cabin's air, and that superheated air instantly began hunting for a way out. It fled through the roof, through the floor, and most critically, it conducted straight through the thin wooden walls into the vast, hungering cold beyond. The moment the fire went untended, the cabin's temperature dropped like a stone. The whole structure was a container shot through with 1,000 holes. Keeping it full demanded a relentless, punishing flood of fuel. For every family in the Bitterroot Valley, this turned winter into a drawn-out siege. Life shrank to a tight circle around the stove. The far corners of the room were essentially abandoned territory. Daily chores became frantic sprints between pockets of bearable warmth. The primary winter labor for every man who could swing an axe was felling, bucking, and splitting firewood. It was a tyrant. A single family might burn through 15 or 20 cords in one season, an entire grove consumed for a few desperate months of survival. The Hollis family, like every neighbor they had, slept in rotation on the worst nights. One person always stayed awake, feeding the ravenous stove, a sentinel standing guard against the advancing freeze. This was the accepted truth of the frontier, a misery to be shouldered without complaint. It was simply the way things were. Lucas Abbey began his work in earnest. The 4 standing walls described an irregular rectangle, roughly 20 feet by 30. River-smoothed and ancient, the stones were massive, bonded by mortar that had crumbled away in dozens of places. His first priority was the foundation itself. For a full 2 weeks, Lucas worked a lever and fulcrum to pry free the most unstable stones at the base. He dug a shallow trench beneath them. Then he packed it tight with the heaviest boulders he could wrestle into position, locking each one with his dense composite of clay, sand, and dried grass. He was not patching a wall. He was grafting it back into the ground. The settlement watched, half pity, half entertainment. Their mockery carried no cruelty. It rose from the honest confusion of capable men watching someone violate every construction principle they trusted. Hollis told him one afternoon, waving at the crooked, weather-scarred walls. Lucas answered, hands caked in wet clay as he drove it deep into a gap. Hollis shook his head, then pivoted to what truly concerned him: economics. Lucas stood. He pressed his palm flat against the sun-baked western wall. The stone radiated heat, almost too hot to hold. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 9, underscore, underscore, he said. Quiet, certain. Then he turned back to his work, offering Hollis nothing but the broad back of a man who had stopped listening. Anya kept her doubts closer to the chest. She watched him toil from first light to last, earth ground into his skin, his hands cracked and raw. What rose from the ground looked nothing like a home. Quote, 10, she said one evening, her voice soft. Her eyes held faith, but threaded through it ran a thin wire of fear, the ghost of frost on iron nails. He replied, with the walls reinforced, sealed, and standing at a uniform 8 feet, he turned to the roof. He cut no planks. Instead, he spanned the gap with stout lodgepole pine rafters, layered them thick with willow boughs and prairie grass. Then he pressed Anya and the children into service hauling buckets of dirt, spreading a full foot of living sod across the entire surface. When the work was done, what stood there looked less like a cabin than a natural formation. A low, green mound with a single entrance and 2 small, deeply set windows. Inside, he built a plain but massive stone hearth and chimney flush against the northern wall, fusing it into the structure as if the fireplace and the building were one organism. His neighbors' ridicule carried through the entire summer. The proof, he understood, would arrive with the frost. To grasp what Lucas Abbey had built, you need to understand thermal mass, a principle entirely separate from insulation. Insulation resists. It blocks the movement of heat. Thermal mass absorbs. It stores heat. Think of it as the difference between a dam and a sponge. A thin wooden wall is a poor dam. Heat passes straight through. A thick stone wall behaves like a massive sponge. It drinks in thermal energy, then holds it for hours. Put it in frontier terms. 1 pound of dry pine burned yields roughly 8,000 British thermal units, BTUs, of energy. A standard Franklin stove of that period might consume 5 pounds of wood per hour, delivering 40,000 BTUs into the living space. Inside Grant Hollis's cabin, with its thin walls, perhaps 90% of that heat bled away within the hour, radiating out into a minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit night. The cabin was a machine for losing energy. Consider the dwelling Lucas Abbey had raised. Those walls stood 2 feet thick. A modest calculation of their combined mass, accounting for the sod roof and packed earthen floor, exceeded 150 tons. 300,000 pounds of raw material surrounding a single family. Stone and earth possess remarkably high specific heat capacity. That means an enormous quantity of energy must be absorbed before their temperature shifts even slightly. During the day, while Lucas tended a moderate fire, much of the 40,000 BTUs generated each hour did not simply heat the air. It migrated deep into the walls themselves, like water pouring into a vast, empty cistern. Sunlight striking the southern and western faces contributed thousands of additional BTUs to this silent accumulation. Every one of those stored BTUs would soon become the difference between life and death. By nightfall, the equation inverted. Outside, temperatures collapsed. Inside a standard wooden cabin, the interior would have followed that same plunge. But the Abbey dwelling obeyed a different set of physical laws entirely. As the room's air cooled, it fell below the temperature locked within those massive walls. Heat flow reversed direction. The 150-ton thermal sponge, gorged on the day's energy, began surrendering that warmth back into the living space. Slowly, steadily. The walls themselves became a quiet, radiant furnace. Lucas had not simply built a shield against the cold. He had engineered a thermal accumulator, a flywheel effect that dampened the savage temperature swings between daylight and darkness. He was banking noon's warmth and spending it at midnight. That December, the valley fell under a brutal, Generational cold snap. 16 consecutive nights, temperatures refused to climb above minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The air turned so dense and bitter that sounds carried for miles. A freezing tree trunk splitting open echoed like a rifle shot. This was dry, windless, bone-deep cold, the kind that bypasses every defense. It became the ultimate reckoning. For settlers sheltered behind timber walls, the ordeal was savage. Existence collapsed into a raw, primal fight for heat. Inside Grant Hollis's meticulously built cabin, his family lived under siege conditions. The woodpile, stacked high each evening, stood nearly exhausted by dawn. Every metal surface in the house burned skin on contact. Ice coated the inside of the windows in thick, opaque sheets, strangling the already feeble winter light. The family pressed together on the warmest patch of floor beside the stove, wrapped in blankets, faces scorched by direct radiance, while their backs stayed cold. Sleep came in fitful fragments, broken by the fire's roar and the gnawing dread that it might die. Inside the Abbey dwelling, the world was altogether different. During daylight hours, Lucas kept a small, even fire burning in the hearth, more for cooking and light than out of any desperate need for warmth. The room's air hung calm and motionless. Not a single draft stirred. As night settled, he let the flames sink to a bed of glowing coals, then banked them with ash to hold through the darkness. After that, silence. The extraordinary thing was how ordinary everything felt. Anya sat in a chair in the far corner, mending clothes, her fingers nimble and quick. On the small wooden table, a pat of butter left from supper stayed soft and easily spreadable come morning. The sounds filling that compact home were not howling wind or the desperate crackle of a starving fire. They were the deep, rhythmic breathing of Emil and Sophie, sleeping peacefully beneath a single wool blanket. Herbs Anya had hung from the rafters still scented the air, a fragrance of summer held intact against the frozen wasteland beyond the walls. The contrast was absolute, and it was measurable. Outside the Hollis cabin, the thermometer read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, with the fire burned down to embers, the interior had dropped to a bitter 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the AB dwelling, the temperature stood at the same minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, with no fire relit since the previous evening, the ambient temperature had settled at a steady 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The visual proof was just as damning. Ice on Hollis's window pane formed a solid, opaque cataract, white and sightless. On the AB's small, deeply recessed window, only a thin lace of frost kissed the lower rim of the glass, a faint concession to the brutal cold being held at arm's length. The stone was doing its work. The mass was holding the heat. The sun's stored energy was keeping them alive. Grant Hollis reached his breaking point on the 10th day of that cold snap. In the brittle half-light before dawn, he found one of his young calves had spooked and kicked through a fence rail. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and set out after the animal, boots punching through crystalline snow with every stride. The cold was not merely weather. It was a physical presence, searing the lining of his lungs with each raw breath. He followed the calf's trail roughly half a mile, and the pursuit drew him toward that peculiar low mound that was the AB property. The animal, blind with terror and disoriented, scrambled along the clearing's edge where the stone structure rose from the earth, jets of steam blasting from its nostrils. Hollis, gasping, his beard frozen into a solid mask of ice, stumbled in the deep drifts. He threw out a hand for balance. His bare palm struck hard against the southern wall of Lucas Abbey's home. His body braced for the familiar shock, that sharp, biting agony of skin meeting frozen stone, cold so fierce it mimics a burn. He expected his flesh to bond to the surface, to feel warmth ripped from his hand in a single merciless instant. That jolt never came. What he felt instead was so profoundly wrong, so violently contrary to every law of winter he had ever known, that his body locked in place. The stone was not cold. It was not warm either, not the way a hearthstone radiates heat. It possessed a deep, resonant neutrality, an absence of cold. Against the piercing minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air gnawing at his back, that profound lack of bite registered as something alive, something warm. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his entire palm flat against the rough face of a large granite boulder. The stone was releasing the lingering essence of yesterday's fire, the memory of the afternoon sun. It seemed to breathe warmth outward. He stood there for a full minute, the panicked calf forgotten, his bare hand pressed to that impossible wall. Frigid air savaged his exposed back, but the stone before him stood as a silent, massive testament to a truth he had once dismissed outright. And then, understanding broke over him like daylight. Later that morning, a humbled Grant Hollis rapped on Lucas Abbey's door. When Lucas pulled it open, Hollis was not met by a blast of heat. Instead, an enveloping stillness washed over him. Calm, even warmth that felt almost sacred in its consistency. His eyes moved across the interior. The children played on a rug spread over the floor, no coats in sight. Anya kneaded dough at the table, sleeves pushed above her elbows. And then he saw it. The definitive, irrefutable evidence. Sitting on the floor near the interior wall, just feet from where his own hand had pressed against the exterior, rested a wooden pail of water. "Your water bucket," Hollis said. His voice came out hoarse. "There's no ice on it." In his own home, a bucket placed that far from the stove would freeze solid within the hour. Lucas A.B. simply inclined his head. His expression remained serene, no trace of triumph. "The stone retains the warmth," he said. Grant Hollis, the master carpenter, the settlement's recognized authority on shelter, surveyed the massive, unadorned walls around him. He no longer saw a crude pile of rock. He perceived an apparatus of elegant, profound engineering. When he finally found his voice,